Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
During our healing process, we investigate present life trauma and even past life trauma. But have we considered injuries we may have sustained while in the womb? Mission Evolution Radio Show is coming to you around the world on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, www.vocbn.ca. With us this hour to explore pre-birth trauma is Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Cherionna is a somatic pre- and perinatal therapist, Continuum somatic inquiry teacher, and a biodynamic craniosacral therapist with a doctorate in prenatal birth and psychology. She's the author of The Breath of Life and Spirit into Form and The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thanks for inviting me.
This just fascinates me. You're a prenatal therapist, but babies don't talk. How do you do that?
Well, actually, you might say babies do talk, not in words, but if we know how to listen, they communicate. And so I'm a prenatal and birth therapist, and that doesn't mean that I necessarily I don't only work with babies that are in the womb or just born. I work with people who have been born, which includes all of us, I think. And we've all had experience. And so I work with people with curiosity about their experience and how that might be affecting them now, regardless of what age they are. And we find that people definitely do have experiences in the womb, and they remember them not the way you and I will hopefully remember this conversation, the conscious memory, but we could describe in words and talk about maybe in a few months from now, but in what we call implicit memory in the field of psychology, which is different from explicit memory, that is memory we can talk about. Implicit memory is held in the body, in emotions, in behavior. And so when we understand how prenatal experience, first of all, that it exists, and secondly, how it might express, we can become more aware of when it might be expressing. And also, I work somatically through the body a lot, and mindfully, with mindful somatic mindfulness inquiry, I support people in inquiring into what their experience is in their body. And if their body wants to move, allowing it to move. And often that will demonstrate for them and for me what might have happened for them when they were long before they could speak.
So do when you got a forming fetus and it's conscious enough to be documenting its experience in the womb, is that documentation? Are you saying it's shared in the saved or stored in the body versus the brain?
Well, before the brain develops, we are having experience. And that can be before much of the body even develops. So cells have experience and remember their experience. You can see that if there's a culture of cells that a scientist is looking at, and they put a toxin into the solution that the cells are in, the cells will respond to that. They'll contract, they'll withdraw, just like any intelligent individual would do exposed to a toxin. Lately,
Go ahead.
the last few years, the immune system has been big in the news. The immune system wouldn't exist if immune cells weren't being aware of when there's an intruder, an unfamiliar intruder, and adapting to its presence by creating a receptor site for it. That's memory. So they're prepared in case the intruder comes back again. That's memory on a cellular level. We begin life as a unicellular organism when sperm and egg come together as what's called a zygote. It's a unicellular organism. It's like one cell.
And then that one cell splits exactly the same for a while, and then it differentiates. At what point? So the cell starts to remember. Then once it differentiates, it starts building a brain and liver and lungs and that sort of thing. Is the memory stored throughout the organs as well?
Yeah, if the memory is from the very beginning, when it was one cell, um, that remnants of that cell go into every part of the body. It's like our ancestors have passed things down to us. The ancestors of each cell have passed things down to it. And also, we see that cells form various things in the body, like bones or heart tissue or whatever, based on their relationship with the cells around them. So they're very aware, like cells that are put into a petri dish with heart cells will develop into heart cells and will actually start to beat in resonance with those heart cells. I mean, they're communicating. It's quite amazing.
It sounds it. So is the memory then almost like in the DNA of the cell, so that it's passed
Well,
on from cell
there
to cell?
is that aspect, and that's the way, one way at least, uh, we take on memories of our ancestors. Epigenetic memory or epigenetic influences have to do with when genes are turned on and off, depending on context. And we know that, if our parents or our grandparents or sometimes further back have had certain kinds of experiences, our our genes will turn on and off as influenced by that experience. It's like we're prepared for a similar kind of environment.
How do we know that? What studies have been done?
Well, I don't remember the names of the various people doing the studies. I'm not very good at that. But, um, there have been studies looking at, for example, uh, let me think for a moment. If a woman has been exposed to a drought or, uh, you know, lack of food, then their child, and I can't remember if this is one that goes down to grandchildren as well, will have a tendency to gain weight. They'll have a slower metabolism so that they're not using up as much food. Like they're prepared for that world that their mother or maybe even their grandmother was living in. So, where they're expecting or they're prepared for a world where there's not enough food. What that means is that when they are in a world where there's lots of food, they tend to gain weight and be overweight. I find that interesting.
So what if it, how can you tell if the experience or the trauma then is prenatal, perinatal, or genetic?
Well, I actually don't tend to separate them all out. I think, when we're in the womb is a time when we're bringing in to this life whatever we need to bring in. And that can include ancestral experiences or influences. So that includes genetic experiences. Genes and various functions are also going to be affected by what the baby in the womb is experiencing, which is usually a direct effect of what their mother is experiencing prenatally.
So as a baby or even as an adult, how what are the symptoms that they've had trauma intrautero?
In babies, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's start with babies, but I'm curious about adults as well.
Yeah. Well, a lot of babies are believed to, have colic because that's common in babies and that's what babies do. What we find when we can do therapy with babies and support them in processing early trauma, often the colic goes away. So that can be one sign. Because, well, often because a lot of the trauma that comes prenatally comes umbilically. So it's coming from the mother, maybe from the mother's stress. Um, and that's coming in umbilically and affecting the baby. It can be overwhelming. It can create a double bind for the baby because they are dependent on the umbilical cord for nourishment and they need that to survive. But if what's coming in is also intense stress hormones or toxicity, say the mother lives in a very polluted environment, for example, or a violent partner, those are toxic influences. So the baby has to receive those if they're going to get the nourishment they need. So that is usually overwhelming for the baby. They don't have a lot of defenses, right? They don't have a lot of ways to defend themselves.
So it sounds like what you've been uncovering goes back to the old wives' tales of you have to protect the mother. You don't want the mother having stress. I mean, I know there was even some rumors. Oh, if she gets a permanent, the baby will have curly hair. I don't think it goes that far, but
I'm not sure about that one.
yeah, exactly.
But the
But
chemicals
yeah,
of the permanent might cause a problem.
there you go, there you go. So when once as an adult, what are the symptoms that maybe I've had prenatal trauma versus this lifetime trauma?
Yeah. Well, first of all, they're not always separate. Prenatal trauma can make us more susceptible to being affected by things that happen after birth. Right? Um, so they know that people who have been traumatized have more tendency to get PTSD when exposed to some challenging experience. And if you've been traumatized in the womb, that applies also. Um, it can show up in different ways. Um, one that's common is to have issues with, we were talking about colic, so issues with digestion or with breathing. Both of those relate to the umbilical cord. I like to look at developmental milestones that happen prenatally and how each of them presents a challenge. That's how we develop, through meeting challenge. And if the challenge is too much, and obviously we've all survived those challenges, but we might have just barely survived. It might have been, overly challenging.
Looks like it's time for a station break. Cherionna and I will return very shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. How can we experience trauma before we're even born? With us discussing prenatal wounding is Cherionna Menzam-Sills, the author of The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, we were discussing, well, the one thing I wanted to ask next is how, we kind of touched in on giving therapy to infants or before they're born, but what are the particulars of that? What does that look
Working with infants, um, it's really very touching work. When part of my background is as a craniosacral therapist, and often people would bring their baby to me for craniosacral therapy, and I'd always work with the mother and the baby together because they're really like one unit even after birth, really for the first year or so. And so often the baby would be on the mother's lap, the mother would be sitting, and I'd do some cranial type work with the mother to help her to settle her nervous system. Often that is enough. The baby will then settle whatever is going on with them. But often babies will take one look at me and it's as if they go, "Oh, you understand. Look, here's my birth." Even if the birth wasn't traumatic, it's a big experience. And when we have a big experience, we want to share it. We want to tell the story. So they tell the story with their body. And that might mean that they start pushing with their little feet. Their head turns the way it would to negotiate the birth canal. Um, and often they had some feelings that came up during the birth process, and they'll engage in those feelings. And they might get stuck somewhere, like how they got stuck during their birth. Or if there were procedures or separation from the mother that happened right after the birth, um, they'll show that. And so
So
when I'm
let me ask you real quick. Now, I understand watching the body language, but when you're talking about the other, do you have to be empathic to be able to pick that up from the baby?
Yeah, I think of it as really just listening, being aware. First of all, being aware of the possibility that they are communicating something. It's not just that they're hungry or need their diaper changed or something like that. They actually, those are important to rule out. But if they have something to communicate, to be aware there's something there. And usually, if I ask the mother what she thinks the baby is expressing, she's usually pretty on. She, like any of us, I think, are capable of feeling the feelings that a baby is expressing. And it's helpful to be able to say something like, "Oh, that was really scary. I'm sorry that was so scary back then." Or, "Oh, you're feeling angry." I don't have to do anything about it. Just acknowledging it, speaking it. And the baby is often visibly relieved that somebody is acknowledging it. And it may be that it's not unusual actually for the baby to be angry at the mother, like especially if the baby was taken away, if there was some separation after birth. It's rare that the mother actually wanted that herself. And so, to support the mother in communicating to the baby, "I'm really sorry that happened. I didn't want that to happen either." And things can shift dramatically.
So, how does the baby understand when they're pre-verbal? I mean, how does this get across to them? You're speaking to them, but how do they get it?
We don't know that. It's a bit mysterious, but they obviously understand. And babies in the womb understand too. That if people understood that, it could help with birth. For example, um, babies who are in an awkward position before birth, like a breech position, like feet first or bum first, um, where often that requires a cesarean section. If somebody talks to them and explains to them that they could turn around and how much easier that would be, often they'll turn around. Right? Somebody not long ago told me that she was um, having signs of labor prematurely. And she spoke to her baby and just basically said, it would be so much better, so much easier if you wait until the due date. And the labor action stopped and didn't start again until I think it was the night of the due date. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I don't know how a baby would know that,
Well, who
but they
initiates
do.
the labor, though? The mother's body or something that the baby triggers?
Usually the baby does, left to its own devices.
How does it do that?
I was afraid you asked that. I'm not very good at these details. um, I know that it puts out some kind of hormones that basically initiate the labor.
Oh, okay, so medically they've ascertained that that's what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
So, how does a traumatic birth affect us later in life?
Mm. We might ask, how does it not affect us later in life? um, so, birth is a major transition. It's our first major transition in life. So, it can profoundly affect how we do and experience transitions. It might be something as simple as how you go to bed at night or get up in the morning. Um, some people are uh, really anxious to get out of bed in the morning. They just jump out of bed. Some people feel kind of anesthetized in the morning, like they were in their birth. you know, some people are always early for things because they were born prematurely, right? Um,
So
He
how do you know this isn't just random? I mean, you're associating things here, but how do you know it's not just random rather than, actual symptoms from trauma at birth?
Well, personally, I've had about 30 years of doing this therapy and seeing it in people. And there are others who came before me in the field of pre and perinatal psychology. There's really interesting research um, by a wonderful pioneer in the field, David Chamberlain, who was a psychologist. And he mostly worked with hypnotherapy. And he saw, that his patients, clients were reporting birth experiences. And he had the same question you had. So what he did was he worked with mother-child pairs where when the child was growing up. And he separately hypnotized each of them back to the birth and got details, got the story from the mother and from the child, and when possible, got the medical records. And the mother and child's stories really resonated. And if one of them uh, was not totally accurate, the baby's story tended to be more accurate than the mother's in relation to the medical records.
You mentioned that some people have pre-birth memories. Um, why do you think some people remember and some people don't? And what do they remember?
Well, I actually think everybody remembers in their body. Um, some people, for some reason, still remember consciously. Um, it's not unusual for toddlers to talk about or do artwork about their experience in the womb. Um, and that can be received in different ways. In our modern Western world, often that isn't understood and isn't reflected the way like a trip to the zoo would be reflected. It's like, oh yeah, you just drew a picture of an elephant with its big ears. That helps it to come into language um, at a time when that part of the brain is developing.
So if indeed um, the children are creating memories, communicating, how much damage are we doing to them by assuming that they cannot and not engaging?
Well, we're creating a lot of pain, I think, which is why I wrote my book, The Prenatal Shadow. I think our prenatal and birth experience is often like unconscious shadow. And so people are acting it out all the time without realizing it and having a lot of misery. And of course, children want to be acknowledged. We all want to be acknowledged and welcomed for who we are and to be believed. And it's painful when we're not, especially when we know our experience really happened.
It's changed a lot over the years, but
Yeah,
back in the 50s and 60s, the father was kept out of the delivery room. The mother was usually put under drugs whether she wanted it or not. I know my mother was, they slapped ether over her face right when she was just about to deliver.
yeah,
And then of
mine
course
too.
they Yeah, and then of course they take the baby into the other room away from the mother, and that time of bonding, there's nobody there for the baby to bond to. What do you see in adults that have had that experience?
Well, first of all, also as a baby of the 50s, um, I find it really interesting that it was around the 60s that the drug culture came to be. And they started using anesthesia a lot in birth, like routinely in the 40s and into the 50s. So as those babies grew up, they tended to go to drugs for, well, automatically, but often, but that was like their way to deal with life because that was the way the initial challenges of birth were dealt with.
It's pretty amazing how the difference between a child whose mother has been drugged during the labor process and a child whose mother has not. We used to think that the floppy head and the loose, the unfocused eyes and all of that was what a newborn is. But I've seen them
Mhm.
pick their head up off their mother's stomach and look them straight in the eye when they aren't drugged. How long did it take them to figure out that the drugs were affecting the child so much?
Well, I think unfortunately they're still not as aware as they could be. But, there's I talk about shadow in my book, that there's collective shadow and cultural shadow, which prevents us from accepting the truth. So there could already be scientific evidence that something like anesthesia is affecting the baby, or some of the other interventions, that they're um, either harmful or not useful, and the medical world continues to do them. So I
Mm.
don't know exactly when they became aware,
Right. Well,
or
we're
if
going
they
we're
are.
going to we're going to have to take another station break. Sheriona and I will be right back to continue our discussion. So you stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What do you mean we're born with a shadow? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the shadow is Sherionna Menzam-Sills. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. So, Sherianna, we started. You were mentioning a shadow that a child has. What is that, and where does it come from?
Well, the term shadow comes from Carl Jung, who was a psychoanalyst, and he used the term to refer to aspects of ourselves that are unacceptable, or that we perceive to be unacceptable. And so we kind of disown them, we push them back into the unconscious. But those parts of us long to be recognized and to be integrated. And so they're always trying to get attention.
So, basically, you're saying we're not whole. We aren't dealing with a full deck if part of us is shoved into denial or into the shadow.
Yeah, you could say that. And that includes our prenatal experience, where it's not acknowledged, where it usually isn't.
So, how much is the mother's experience before or during birth related to the baby's shadow?
Well, that can be a huge influence. So, babies in the womb are preparing to live in their mother's world. And so it's as if they have their radar out for, what's coming from the mother. And the mother's experience is being communicated to the baby, mainly, as far as we know, um, through the umbilical cord. So, through various hormones, like stress hormones, for example. Although there seems to also be an ability for babies to sense energetically, which maybe we can talk about separately. But if a mother is experiencing her world as very safe and supportive, the baby prepares for that kind of world. But if the mother is experiencing her world as threatening or dangerous, or say she has a violent spouse or something like that, or she's in a war zone, there's a lot of stress hormones coming through. And babies of mothers who have experienced extreme or ongoing stress are born with altered stress hormone levels, altered cortisol levels that tend to be the same as mothers.
So that what kind of a test have they done? And drawn a lot of blood of babies at birth? How do we know that?
I think that's how they measure cortisol. They actually, I think there's a saliva test they can do. I don't think it has to be quite that violent, but there's a
Is it
lot of violence done to babies in that way.
speaking of which, um, I hope it's changed, but clear up when I was having children, up until that time, when a boy was born, they were slapped on the circumcision board, and without any
Mhm,
anesthesia, they were circumcised. Now, talk about creating a shadow or trauma.
mhm.
Um, are they still doing that? And if what kind of effect is that having on our men?
Yeah. Well, good question. I don't think they're doing it quite as automatically. There is some choice involved in it from not by the baby. The baby doesn't get to choose, right? Um, the it would be rare for anybody to explain to the baby why this is being done or to prepare them for it and tell them that it's something painful is going to happen. Um, as recently, by the way, as 1985, they were doing surgery on babies without anesthesia. They'd give them a paralytic drug so they couldn't move, but the belief was that they wouldn't remember it anyway, so why did it matter? So there's all these people wandering around, born up until that time, not knowing why they're hypervigilant, or their nervous system just can't calm down, or they're terrified. And I I think it's probably obvious, when men have been circumcised, it affects their sexuality as well, and their feelings towards their own sexuality. Um, so if their sexual organs are treated with what feels like violence as soon as they come into the world, how do you think they might engage in sexual activity? It probably won't be as sensitive as it could be. They're probably not going to be as relational as they could be, and they're probably still in shock.
And the message is there's something wrong with you there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
something wrong with you. It's
Yeah.
just terrifying to me what we still do sometimes. So you talk about original embryological potential. What is that?
Embryological potential.
Thank
Sorry
you.
to come up with such a difficult word. Some people call it embryonic. Um, yeah, that's a term that I came up with, and it's influenced by other work that I've done with biodynamic craniosacral therapy and also Continuum, the somatic movement inquiry work that I do. That was developed by Emilie Conrad. That basically, I think of it as embryos having an incredible potential ahead of them that they're holding and that they're embodying. So if you think about that original unicellular organism that is there when the egg and the sperm come together, it's relatively simple as a body, but it develops these very complex bodies. How does it do that? That's incredible potential. And then we go through different developmental milestones as in the womb, just like we do after birth. And we somehow have an ability to meet those and to adapt to the changes that they require. So the embryo body is constantly changing. There's incredible potential there. Also, embryos are much more fluid than we are. We're made up mostly of water, but embryos even more so. And fluid is highly resonant. It can pick up messages kind of energetically. It's also very flexible. You think about water in a stream going around a rock. It knows how to go. It will alter its path as it needs to. It's resilient, something we need these days in our rather challenging world. Uh, it's sensitive. Little ones in the womb are incredibly sensitive because they're learning about the world they're preparing for. These are all qualities that are in our potential, and they may have gotten clouded over where there's been trauma. And so then they're in shadow.
So we're if what you're saying is we're born very, very fluid and designed to be fluid.
Yes.
Do you feel that as we lose that fluidity as adults, you know, is that because that's part of our design to lose it, or is it through we're losing a lot of things that we don't have to lose, or in the process?
Well, interesting. What I learned from Emilie Conrad and Continuum is that, yes, we lose our fluidity, we coalesce into form, but ideally, we're designed not to stay that way. I mean, not to be a puddle, but we can slow down and come back to a fluidic state. The same thing happens in craniosacral therapy, actually. So we can reconnect with that potential. But what most of us do in our modern world is we just keep going and going and going. And so we get more and more dense and coalesced. And nothing can flow properly in our bodies. So then
Do
we
you,
become stiff and rigid.
do you think that becoming stiff and rigid is a result of not addressing the shadow, not addressing the trauma from birth onward?
I do, actually. Yeah, interesting question. Certainly I've found for myself that the more I've addressed that time in my life, the freer I've been to be who I am, and which includes not being so rigid. I don't have to just be what I was taught or what I learned I had to be in order to be at least accepted somewhat, and
So
survive.
our socialization contributes to our rigidity?
Very much so. Yeah. I don't know how it was when you were growing up. When I was in school in the 60s, um, in grade one, little 6-year-olds, we were supposed to sit at our desk with our hands clasped on the desk, and not move. A 6-year-old is incapable of learning anything without their body, without moving. They learn how to disown the body and be in the head. And bodies get stiff when they're like that.
You're also giving the body the message that it's not acceptable not to be stiff, right?
Yeah,
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 yeah.
interesting. And it's true, if it's something we talk about in Continuum because we go into very strange kinds of shapes that just emerge as we become more fluid. And it's like, that's not the way we would walk down the street, you know? Like, that wouldn't be very acceptable to be moving in odd ways as you walk down the street.
So, what creates our potential? DNA, horoscope, past life? You know, everybody comes probably with a bit of a different potential, don't they? What creates it?
Yes. And you're asking one of those questions that I don't think can be answered. I think it's an expression of the mystery.
Well, it's mysterious, all right. So, how does the prenatal shadow relate to our original embryo? What you said, or to our original potential.
um, well, our original embryological potential can be in shadow because of or starting at some point prenatally um, because of trauma. So, if we have to overly adapt to survive uh, very challenging situations in the womb, we might be so overwhelmed by that our potential, at least some aspect of it, gets forgotten. And so it's in shadow until we do some healing and we come back to it.
So, it's from what you're saying, it's possible to reclaim that even if you've lost it.
Absolutely. It's never really lost. We may have lost touch with it. We may have forgotten about it. It's still there.
Where is it stored in our body?
I love your questions. um, I think the access to it is in the body, but it's not just in the body. When we do various kinds of meditation, often we'll feel lighter or we'll have a sense of light
Well, I'm
or
sorry to leave a cliffhanger, but we have to have another station break. Please stay with us as Cherionna and I continue to explore prenatal and perinatal trauma. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. If it happened before we were born, how do we heal it? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Her website, birthingyourlife.org. Cherionna, there's the question. Once, if it happened even before we were born, and we probably don't have any memory of it, how do we get at it to heal it?
Hmm. Well, they say the first step in healing is awareness. So I've made it my mission in life to spread awareness of the possibility that any of us might have had experience in the womb, and it might have been traumatic. And so once we have some understanding that that's a possibility, and we look at the kinds of things that could have happened, then often they start to light up in us. So if I talk about having umbilical toxicity, like something toxic coming in umbilically, often people have some response to that and they resonate with that. Or the idea of having lost a twin in the womb. So many people have lost a twin in the womb, and it shows up all the time in pre and perinatal therapy. People resonate with that. And
How can you tell if they're resonating with it or it's an acquired memory?
I don't know what an acquired memory is.
Acquired memory was certainly in the mainstream a few years back, and it's where they were saying that, sometimes hypnosis or sometimes therapy can give a person ideas,
Right,
and then they make it their experience when indeed it wasn't necessarily their experience.
right.
That's what acquired memory is.
I understand the concept. I just don't
Okay.
think it's accurate. If you really know how to look, I don't think you're going to be making up memories. So, especially pre and perinatal memories, because they're in the body. So, the body doesn't lie. And people generally in our modern Western world aren't connected enough with their bodies to even know how to make it pretend that it had an experience that it didn't have. Yeah. So, I don't think acquired memory is actually possible in in the way I'm looking at memory.
So you say the shadow includes our potential. Let's go into that a little bit.
Hmm. What would you like to know about potential?
Well, you said how much of it is in the shadow and how do we milk it back out of there?
Okay. So, um, well, part of it, what can be really important is working through our trauma so that then you might say, our true essence can shine. We're not just expressing our traumatic history unconsciously. So then our potential comes out of hiding. Okay? So, for example, I'll give an example of something that can be traumatic prenatally and often is at the time when the pregnancy is discovered, often the parents, even if they wanted a child, are at least a little bit ambivalent about it. It's like, oh, I wasn't ready for that. I can't think of how many times I've heard from a parent who's pregnant or had a baby. It's like, I just wanted to take that one trip to Nepal, or to um, get a bigger place to live, or have a job, or have a partner. All those kinds of things, even if they want a child. And even if the couple is trying, sometimes they feel like, oh, wasn't expecting that to happen so soon. So, um, the time of discovery, there can be ambivalence, or it could be much more extreme actual rejection of the baby. And little ones experience that. Intelligently, they react to that because their survival depends entirely on being welcomed and being accepted. They're not safe if their parents aren't welcoming them. So that's a major trauma. And the message that rejection at that time carries is that there's something wrong with them, that they're not good enough, or they need to stay small in order to not be discovered. And so then people tend to live their lives that way, feeling bad about themselves or hiding themselves, not daring to be as big as they are. So potential is something that shows up when it shows up. It's big, it shines. And so they may have learned to hide that. When there could be healing around that kind of rejection or those bad feelings about themselves, then the potential starts to come out.
How does one heal that? I mean, do you just talk about it? Do you try to experience it? How do you heal something like that?
Yeah, I find, um, yeah, talking about it is part of the healing. Um, Usually, people need to have an experience that's different from what they experienced back then.
But
So,
don't we interpret all of our experience by our wounding? So no matter what the experience, we will interpret it like, oh, here we go again.
yeah, so something that we do in somatic pre and perinatal therapy that I practice is we teach people to differentiate. It's like, that's how it was back then. And now you're with me or with a group of people. I work a lot in very small groups where we establish a safe relational field where people can be safe and welcomed. And we practice differentiating. Okay, that's how it was then. Now, can you see who's with you now, here, your current age? Can you see how or feel how you're actually safe here? And then there's the chance for people to actually receive what's available now in a safe therapeutic environment.
So
That
are
can
you, sorry, go ahead.
that can change things. It seems to me it changes things on a cellular level. People's lives are changed from that kind of experience.
So when you're doing that, like in a group, are you using the power of group agreement to create a space that was not there when the child suffered the damage?
Yeah, you could say that. So the small groups that I do, they're called um, womb surround process workshops. And I usually limit them to 4 participants, and I have an assistant and me. And this is the work of Ray Castellino, another pioneer in the field of pre and perinatal therapy. And he developed a set of principles which are based on his work with families and babies and pregnant families, based on what little ones and pregnant families or new families need. And they really establish and maintain safety within a group. So we go over the principles and everybody agrees to those principles, and I help them to do that. And one of the principles has to do with self-regulating, slowing down when we need to, because when we speed up, it's easy to get re-traumatized or just do our pattern. When we slow down, we can become more mindful and make different choices, and things can actually change.
Well, I'm sure right about now my audience is wondering, or our audience is wondering, so what symptoms do I need to look for to see if my some of my traumas or patterns really originated pre and before birth?
Right. Well, I can't promise that if you have any of these symptoms, you had prenatal or birth trauma, um, but there is likelihood. Um, so I mentioned discovery, and often people who have trauma from the time of discovery, first of all, in their bodies, they tend to be kind of caved in at the chest. The heart is developing usually at the time of discovery. And so that area, the heart and the chest, tend to hold the memories. And so there's a protective kind of stance. And that often goes with feelings of needing to hide, of for example, I've done a lot of supervision work with new practitioners who, they need to put themselves out. They need to make a business card or a website, or um, these days it's probably things like a podcast or whatever. And they're terrified, or they just can't get themselves to do it, even if they know how to do it. And we do some work together and discover that they weren't welcomed at the time of discovery. They do some work around that, and then they're able to put themselves out. Okay, so that kind of thing, hiding, keeping small, feeling bad about yourself, or being what we call a prenatal therapist. So babies will try to take care of their mother. Of course, they're not very good at it because they're too little, but a lot of us therapists started back then, it seems. And so they'll have a pattern of caretaking, forgetting about their own needs and taking care of the other, getting into relationships where that's what happens.
So,
I could go on for a long time, but there's a lot of symptoms.
so how does the information regarding prenatal trauma and the shadow aid personal evolution?
Ah, well, I think it comes back to potential again. As we acknowledge trauma, then our potential can come forth. And that's not just our potential as individuals, but if birth trauma is holding us back, there's been a lot of birth trauma, the way birth has been conducted in the world for the last few hundred years.
Certainly in the Western world,
In the
yes.
Western world, yeah,
Mm.
the modern Western world. And um, I wouldn't be surprised if we were able to heal all that, if we might not have such a tendency to have wars.
Mm. Hmm.
If we might, I know that we wouldn't be treating babies as um, insensitively as has been happening. For ex-
Well, go ahead.
I'm just thinking of a common example of the umbilical cord being cut right after birth. They have started delaying it for a minute or 3 minutes or something like that. That's now medically advised. But um, cutting the umbilical cord prematurely, which is before it stops pulsating, is actually traumatizing for the baby.
Well, I can
And
believe it. They're cutting your lifeline.
exactly.
Unfortunately, Sheriona, we are out of time. Thank you so
Uh,
much for coming on the show.
well, thank you. And we obviously have a lot to talk about. So thanks for
Yes,
your
we do.
interesting questions.
Mhm. Our guest this hour has been Cherionna Menzam-Sills, the author of The Breath of Life and Spirit into Form and The Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth. To find out more about Cherionna, where you can find her books and all she has to offer, visit her website, birthingyourlife.org. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy our past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us again right here on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, vocbn.ca, where this mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.